Yes, we can understand how trauma impacts the brain and the body, but it each touches us so intimately differently, which is why our treatment can't just be a one size fits all. But how do we actually research resiliency in human beings? How do we study the effects of trauma because it's so unique, because it's so intimate, because it's so on the body? And he's going to go into the science of it. So if you're interested, stay tuned, because I mean, this book it's very triggering, right? I'm a firm believer that the triggers are the guide. When we feel triggered about something, it feels, to me, we're being called to heal, right? We're being called to pay attention, right? Hello, right? That's what the trigger's saying. Hello, pay attention to me. So when you get triggered, right, instead of running away, right, we breathe. We tap into the feeling, right? We don't have to label, oh, when I'm feeling this, it's all this anxiety or all this shame. Of course, maybe we know what it is, right? But sometimes I think a better question from how are you feeling, right, is what are you feeling? Because when you ask yourself what, it could be a fire in your belly, right? Tightness in my throat, pressure on my chest, right? Because these are words that don't have to be necessarily charged. So I'm excited for this journey we get to go on together. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. I've been challenging myself to post my thoughts, so share my inner world outside of myself, every day. And I fell off for about a week, and now I'm coming back again, and I'm doing something that I think will keep me accountable. Yay! Love you, Hallie. I'll send it to you afterwards. It should be brief. You as well, John. But something that will keep me accountable is I wanted to share about some of the books that I'm reading because they're really transforming my life. There's two in particular, but I felt like it'd be good content for video, and also this is a great book that everybody should read. So, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma, right, by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And okay. All I'm going to do today is read the prologue with y'all, but how this is going to go is I'll probably hop on once a day, I'm not going to read a whole chapter because some of these chapters are thick, but I will summarize and talk about my takeaways and such like that, okay? So here's the prologue, Facing Trauma. And I'm also going to post these on YouTube, so you're going to see it there. One does not have to be a combat soldier or visit a refugee camp in Syria or the Congo to encounter trauma. Trauma happens to us, our friends, our families, and our neighbors. Research by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has shown that 1 in 5 Americans was sexually molested as a child. 1 in 4 was beaten by a parent to the point of a mark being left on their body. And 1 in 3 couples engages in physical violence. A quarter of us, that's 1 in 4, right? So when this room started, there were 4 people in here, including myself. 1 of us grew up with alcoholic relatives, and 1 out of 8 witnessed their mother being beaten or hit. As human beings, we belong to an extremely resilient species. Since time immemorial, we have rebounded from our relentless wars, countless disasters, both natural and man-made, and the violence and betrayal in our own lives. But traumatic experiences do leave traces, whether on a large scale on our cultures and histories, right? That's the trace of trauma on our collective scale, or close to home on our families, with dark secrets being imperceptibly passed down through generations. They also leave traces on our minds and emotions, on our capacity for joy and intimacy, and even on our biology and immune systems. Trauma affects not only those who are directly exposed to it, but also those around them, right? Soldiers returning home from combat may frighten their families with their rages and emotional absence. The wives of men who suffer from PTSD tend to become depressed, and the children of depressed mothers are at risk of growing up insecure and anxious. Having been exposed to family violence as a child often makes it difficult to establish stable, trusting relationships as an adult. Trauma, by definition, is unbearable and intolerable. Most rape victims, combat soldiers, and children who have been molested become so upset when they think about what they experienced that they try to push it out of their minds, trying to act as if nothing happened, and move on. It takes tremendous energy to keep functioning while carrying the memory of terror and the shame of utter weakness and vulnerability. While we all want to move beyond trauma, the part of our brain that is devoted to ensuring our survival, deep below our rational brain, is not very good at denial. We'll get into this later, but the brain is built from the bottom up. We start with the reptilian brain, which is all about survival, right? It's like what's on when a baby's born. Crying, when I'm wet, uncomfortable, etc. Then it moves up into the mammalian brain in terms of how we're developed, and then the neocortex, which is our rational brain, comes up. But our emotional brain, a large part of ourselves, which is dedicated to our survival, doesn't do well with denial. It just responds, right? Long after a traumatic experience is over, it may be reactivated at the slightest hint of danger and mobilize disturbed brain circuits and secrete massive amounts of stress hormones. This precipitates unpleasant emotions, intense physical sensations, and impulsive and aggressive actions. This precipitates unpleasant emotions. These post-traumatic reactions feel incomprehensible and overwhelming. Feeling out of control, survivors of trauma often begin to fear that they are damaged to the core and beyond redemption. The first time I remember being drawn to study medicine was at a summer camp when I was about 14 years old. My cousin Michael kept me up all night explaining the intricacies of how kidneys work, how they secrete the body's waste, and then reabsorb the chemicals that keep the system in balance. I was riveted by his account of the miraculous way the body functions. Later, during every stage of my medical training, whether I was studying surgery, cardiology, or pediatrics, it was obvious to me that the key to healing was understanding how the human organism works. When I began my psychiatry rotation, however, I was struck by the contrast between the incredible complexity of the mind and the ways that we human beings are connected and attached to each other, and how little psychiatrists knew about the origins of the problems they were treating. How would it be possible one day to know as much about brains, minds, and love as we do about the other systems that make up our organism? We are obviously still years from attaining that sort of detailed understanding, but the birth of 3 new branches of science have led to an explosion of knowledge about the effects of psychological trauma, abuse, and neglect. Those new disciplines are neuroscience, the study of how the brain supports mental processes, developmental psychopathy, or psychopathology, developmental psychopathology, the study of the impact of adverse experiences on the development of mind and brain, and interpersonal neurobiology, the study of how our behavior influences the emotions, biology, and mindsets of those around us. Research from these new disciplines has revealed that trauma produces actual physiological changes, including a recalibration of the brain's alarm system, an increase in stress hormone activity, and alterations in the system that filters relevant information from irrelevant. We now know that trauma compromises the brain area that communicates the physical, embodied feeling of being alive. These changes explain why traumatized individuals become hypervigilant to threat at the expense of spontaneously engaging in their day-to-day lives. They also help us understand why traumatized people so often keep repeating the same problems and have so much trouble learning from experience. We now know that their behaviors are not the result of moral failings or sign of lack of willpower or bad character. They are caused by actual changes on the brain. Trauma changes your brain, right? When you experience something that overloads your system and how you cope, your body's kicking in to cope. So your body now has to adapt. Your brain is adapting to protect you and keep you safe. And because a lot of the time after trauma, we're not soothed, we're not brought back down, we're not explained to what happened, we don't come back into our bodies, everything is off, it's changed now. And there's no body there. If it keeps going on, if you didn't even notice that's happening, it's just a thing that happened. Now it's gone unchecked. Nobody there to calm it down, right? But your brain actually shifts in how it has to perceive the world in order for you to cope, right? When we're dealing with trauma. The vast increase in our knowledge about the basic processes that underlie trauma has also opened up new possibilities to palliate. There are fundamentally 3 avenues. Top down, by talking. That's one. Top down by talking, reconnecting with others, and allowing ourselves to know and understand what is going on with us while processing the memories of the trauma. 2, by taking medicines that shut down inappropriate alarm reactions, or by utilizing other technologies that change the way the brain organizes information. And 3, bottom up, by allowing the body to have experiences that deeply and viscerally contradict the helplessness, rage, or collapse that result from trauma. Which one of these is best for any particular survivor is an empirical question. Most people I have worked with require a combination. So he's talking about the 3 ways that we can really utilize and practice our neuroplasticity of our brain, right? Neuroplasticity being that our brains are elastic in how we learn, right? But how we, sometimes when we get to trauma, right, can stiffen our brain, right? It's jolted and stuck. So he's talking about the 3 ways that you could really get into it, and this is what he spends the book talking about. The first way is by talking from the top down, so starting from the neocortex, the logical brain, and moving it down, right? That's like mindfulness, being able to sit and observe what's going on in your mind and understand and processing trauma in that way. Then the second one is through medication, right? Because if our alarm systems are off, because if trauma changes the brain and now we're firing different stress hormones, we're just enacting different things to keep ourselves safe. Sometimes it's inappropriate, right? Like if you smell smoke, of course you should run outside. But if you smell smoke and there's no smoke and you're running outside screaming, dysregulated, right? So sometimes there's medication to help people turn off particular alarms or different stress hormones so they can secrete less, right? Or secrete more. And then bottom up is from the reptilian brain up to the neocortex, right? So letting the body feel things that almost overwhelm your ability to think your way out of it. It's like becoming present, right? And like he's saying, survivors typically use a combination of the 3, right? It's not always, and a lot of the time our medical industry, what we're doing is we're going one or the other, or, you know, one thing only, versus not taking a holistic approach, right? This has been my life's work. And this effort I have been supported by my colleagues and students at the Trauma Center, which I founded 30 years ago. Together, we have treated thousands of traumatized children and adults, victims of child abuse, natural disasters, wars, accidents, and human trafficking. People who have suffered assaults by intimates and strangers. We have a long tradition of discussing all our patients in great depth at weekly treatment team meetings and carefully tracking how well different forms of treatment work for particular individuals. That's what I love about this too, is like everybody needs an individualized approach, because yes, we can understand how trauma impacts the brain and the body, but it each touches us so intimately differently, which is why our treatment can't just be a one size fits all, right? Our principal mission has always been to take care of the children and adults who have come to us for treatment. But from the very beginning, we have also dedicated ourselves to conducting research to explore the effects of traumatic stress on different populations and to determine what treatments work for whom. We have been supported by research grants from the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Center of Complementary and Alternative Medicine, the Centers for Disease Control, and a number of private foundations to study the efficacy, right, of many different forms of treatment, from medications to talking, yoga, EMDR, theater, and neurofeedback. There's a lot of things in this book that I would say could be potentially controversial. He's talking about the development of the psychiatry and, branch, and there's all kinds of stuff going on, so you're in for a treat. The challenge is, how can people gain control over the residues of past trauma and return to being masters of their own ship? Talking, understanding, and human connections help, and drugs can dampen hyperactive alarm systems. But we will also see that the imprints from the past can be transformed by having physical experiences that directly contradict the helplessness, rage, and collapse that are part of trauma, and thereby regaining self-mastery. I have no preferred treatment modality, as no single approach fits everybody, but I practice all the forms of treatment that I discuss in the book. Each of them can produce profound changes depending on the nature of the particular problem and the makeup of the individual person. I wrote this book to serve as both a guide and an invitation to dedicate ourselves to facing the reality of trauma, to explore how best to treat it, and to commit ourselves as a society to using every means we have to prevent it. So that's just the prologue for today. Like I said, I'm not going to read as much in the future because, like I said, these chapters are thick. They can be quite thick, and I've highlighted and stuff, so this is a good time to actually brush up on the highlights and stuff. But takeaway points is that trauma is something that happens to us, right? That's something that we experience. You don't have to be in a war zone or experience rape or violence to suffer from trauma, right? Trauma is anything, I think, any experience that overwhelms our ability to process, right? It where you feel stuck, or I don't even know how to begin to, any of those kinds of feelings is usually, right, where trauma is happening. And as he will cover in the book, and we'll find out along the journey, it's like a lot of medicine has not considered trauma as its own thing, right? So PTSD is, yes, one way that trauma shows up, but how about for folks who don't have flashbacks, right? Are they not traumatized? And so what he also asks, he asks some really great questions in the book about how do we even, and he talks about a little bit, you heard about the research that he's been paid to do, but how do we actually research resiliency in human beings? How do we study the effects of trauma, because it's so unique, because it's so intimate, because it's so on the body? And he's going to go into the science of it. So if you're interested, stay tuned, because I mean, this book it's very triggering, right? I'm a firm believer that the triggers are the guide. When we feel triggered about something, feels, to me, we're being called to heal, right? We're being called to pay attention, right? Hello, right? That's what the trigger's saying. Hello, pay attention to me. So when you get triggered, right, instead of running away, right, we breathe. We tap into the feeling, right? We don't have to label, oh, when I'm feeling this, it's all this anxiety or all this shame. Of course, maybe we know what it is, right? But sometimes I think a better question from how are you feeling, right, is what are you feeling? Because when you ask yourself what, it could be a fire in your belly, right? Tightness in my throat, pressure on my chest, right? Because these are words that don't have to be necessarily charged. So I'm excited for this journey we get to go on together. And stay tuned tomorrow. We will do chapter 1. Just in case you want that in advance, the name of chapter 1 is, so part 1 is the rediscovery of trauma. Lesson 1, chapter 1 is lessons from Vietnam veterans. So see y'all tomorrow, and yeah, thanks for listening.